And when you all set that priority for sustainable agriculture back in 2007, did you expect Mr. Preston to act on those goals and priorities of the council?
Sure we did.
And are you aware in 2007, in an effort to act on those priorities of the council, that Mr. Preston contracted with a contractor to help consult with them about promoting sustainable agriculture in Anderson County?
I'm not aware that it occurred in that time frame.
Were you present at a meeting where Ms. Wilson raised a complaint about a contractor who was an agricultural consultant?
I vaguely remember her raising that issue at some point in time.
And if the minutes reflected that at the time she complained about that, she stated on the record in the minutes that Allison Sham was Mr. Wilson's daughter, would you have any reason to dispute that?
Ask me that question again.
Sure, I'm sorry, it was a little bit long. If the minutes reflected at that time when Ms. Wilson raised the concerns about this agricultural consulting, that she brought up Allison's relationship to Mr. Wilson, would you have any reason to dispute that?
I'm going to try to be as polite as I can.
Yes, sir.
I question anything that Ms. Wilson tells me.
Okay, fair enough. And you don't listen to that radio program, do you?
Absolutely not.
So if it was on that radio program, too, that Ms. Shawn was Mr. Wilson's daughter, you wouldn't have known that either?
No.
Now, if you had known that Allison Shawn had gotten a contract, were you aware of the Sustainable Agricultural Conference that occurred at the end of October in 2008?
The one that was held at the Civic Center?
Yes, sir.
Yes. In fact, I talked with Mr. Wilson concerning sustainable agriculture, and I thought that it was a good thing and was supportive of it.
And in your capacity as a council member, did you deem that conference that occurred over the course of the last weekend in October of 2008 a success?
As far as I know, it was, yes.
And if the contract for Ms. Shawn was executed the very day after that contract or that conference ended, do you think that would be inappropriate?
Not necessarily, no.
And had you known that that contract had been executed, and had you known of this relationship between Ms. Shawn and Mr. Wilson, would that have changed your vote on November 18th?
No.
Now, you, up until the time of the severance and thereafter, you haven't had a business relationship with Mr. Preston, have you?
Other than selling him hay for his donkey.
How many times have you sold him hay for Cindy Lou?
Probably 2 or 3 times.
How much do you charge for hay?
I charge him what I charge everybody else.
Did he buy hay from you before November 18th of 2008?
I think he did.
All right. And did his buying hay for Cindy Lou in any way affect your vote on November 18th of 2008?
Absolutely not.
You know, we're going to stipulate a hay transaction.
I appreciate you willing to do so, and I would accept stipulation. You may proceed.
Did you receive any personal benefit in exchange for your vote on Joey Preston's severance?
No.
And in fact, it's been quite the contrary, hasn't it?
It's costing me somewhere between $3,000 and $8,000 to be here today.
What were you supposed to be doing instead?
I should be in New York on a storm response team at this time.
And I apologize, sir. With regard to November 18th of 2008, do you recall if there was any items on the agenda already that dealt with the employment of Mr. Preston?
Yes, there was.
And I'm going to show you what's been pre-admitted and marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 4. When the correct, Sherman.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell me the item on the agenda that you believe could have covered or given the public notice of severance regarding Mr. Preston?
Item 16 on page 2 of the agenda reads, discussion of the authority of county council to employ the administrator was placed on the agenda by Mr. Bob Walter, requested 10 minutes, and he was allotted 10 minutes.
And as a council member, if you put something on the agenda about what you have in mind that you want to pass, did it always come out the way you wanted it to come out?
No, it can be actually, and it has been at times, taken over by another council member and proceed with and run with.
Now, when you were talking amongst the personnel committee, let's go back to one of the questions that Mr. Tessier asked you. I believe he showed you the notes from Mr. Bright, thank you, about your conversation with Mr. Bright on the 13th of October of 2008. Do you have those?
Yes, I do.
Now, Mr. Bright called you prior to the first personnel committee meeting, is that correct?
I'm not sure if he called me before then or after.
Okay, I'm going to give you something else maybe that'll help.
I don't have the date fixed in my mind, so if you're asking me before or after, I can't answer truthfully.
I'm going to show you what's been pre-marked Defendants Exhibit 70. These are two agendas for two personnel committee meetings. Does that help refresh your recollection, sir, about the personnel committee meeting dates?
The first one was on October the 27th, so if Mr. Bright's notes are correct, then he did call me before the first meeting.
And were you made aware by him that he was calling other members of council as well?
I was.
Now, up until the time of the severance vote, what had the votes on council been for things that were favored by you and Mr. Wilson and Mr. Thompson?
Mr. Wallop and Ms. Wilson, if you probably check the record, would historically oppose most of it.
And so how many votes would there normally be in favor of things you wanted versus things that Ms. Wilson and Ms. Wallop wanted?
Usually, well, it takes 5 actually to have a successful vote. So if it was successful, it was 5, and if it wasn't, it was 4. But I do remember one item in particular that I pushed very strongly, and I still feel very strongly about it. I feel like Anderson County is being unfair to its citizens, and it should be changed. And that is that in the ordinances, there is a section that deals with changing road right-of-ways. And I pushed to have that changed so that they didn't take citizens' property without compensation. And when we went into the vote on that, I had 5 votes. I had counted them. When we voted, I only had 4.
So things changed.
Things changed.
Going into the meeting on November 18th of 2008, did you know for sure that all of your colleagues were going to vote in favor of this severance?
You don't know for sure until they raise their hand.
And when things start being discussed amongst individual council members, is there anything illegal about one council member going and lobbying another council member?
No.
Is there anything illegal if that council member goes and lobbies a third council member?
No.
And in fact, it's only illegal when those parties are together if there's either A, a quorum of the council, which is 4 or more members, right? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Or B, if you're on a committee, all members of the committees, right?
The county code says that a minimum of 3 is required for a quorum of a committee.
All right. So if, say, you and Mr. Wilson were meeting with Ms. Floyd to talk to Mr. Cunningham, that wouldn't be a quorum of the personnel committee, would it, sir?
No, ma'am, it would not.
And the consensus that you all had about the fact that Michael Cunningham could be hired as the county administrator, subject to working out the details of his contract, were also subject to the council approving Mr. Preston's severance, right?
It was all contingent upon that, yes.
And had the severance not been approved, then Mr. Cunningham's hiring would actually violate Mr. Preston's contract, wouldn't it?
It would.
Now, with regard to the incidents, I'm going to show you, Mr. Tessier asked you about the termination for cause provision. I'm going to show you what's been marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 1 and ask you if you see anything in here that says about a general compliance with the state constitution, or is it subject to the duties as outlined in paragraph 1 of the contract, which are the duties under home rule?
Okay, now ask me your question again, please.
Sure. Mr. Tessier, I think, asked you, didn't Mr. President also have to comply with the general laws of the Constitution of the state of South Carolina? Or that could be a breach. But in that provision, isn't that subject to in discussing the duties as set forth in paragraph 1 of the contract, which are the duties as it's set out in the home rule?
That would be my understanding and interpretation. It says that compliance with the laws and Constitution of the state of South Carolina and performance of duties set forth in section 1 of this agreement.
And when you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And basically it's saying that he's got to comply with the code of laws of South Carolina.
All right. Now, when you talked about, let's talk about what you knew on November 18th of 2008. Y'all had personnel committee meetings leading up to that, right?
That's correct.
And Mr. Bright was coming to, he came to both of those personnel committees that I gave you the agendas for. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And y'all weren't trying to keep Mr. Wilson or Ms. Wilson and Mr. Walter out by having this meeting up in Powdersville, were you?
No.
And in fact, in the place, the government building that's owned by Anderson County that was up in Powdersville, isn't it not even a half mile from Mr. Wilson's office?
It's almost within walking distance.
And Mr. Bright's office is up in Greenville, is that correct?
It was closer for him.
Y'all paying Mr. Bright by the hour?
I would assume so. Most of you work by the hour.
We're a dangerous lot with that. And
At least my check where I paid you for the last time shows it by the hour.
thank you, sir. With regard to the meeting y'all had up there, you and Mr. McAbee traveled up there for that meeting, right?
That's correct.
And then the next meeting y'all had was in the courthouse across the street, right?
That's correct.
Now, at these personnel committee meetings, were you all inquiring to Mr. Bright about the legitimacy of the anticipatory breach claim and what the options were for the county to resolve it?
We discussed those options and the anticipatory breach, yes.
Did you specifically question Mr. Bright with regard to his analysis under the Coward decision?
We discussed it somewhat, and based on what I had read in the South Carolina Code of Laws, and I did pull them up sometime previous and read some of these, and what I knew about the Powdersville administrators thing, I felt that Mr. Bright did not have, this is my opinion, that he did not have a full and thorough understanding of the differences between an administrator's contract and position and that of an administrator of a water utility.
Why did you believe there was a difference?
In my opinion, there was a very big difference. As Mr. Tessier said in my deposition, I'm not an attorney, but I do read. And the home rule says that an administrator can be employed by a contract for years, plural. It does not say 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. It just simply says plural. The Powdersville administrator, to my knowledge, is not covered in the Code of Laws through the contractual thing. And it's my understanding that the contract that the Powdersville administrator had was a lengthy contract. I believe I've heard the term 20 years plus. So there was a big difference between that and what would be a contract for an administrator of a county government.
And when Mr. Bright provided you advice as reflected in a memorandum we pre-admitted Defendants Exhibit 8, I'll let you review that. 28, I'm sorry, if you want to review that. But when Mr. Bright met with you all, gave you all legal advice as reflected in that memorandum, did he give you one option or a number of options?
This list that you provided, there are several options.
And were there other options that he didn't provide?
There was one option on there that was overlooked. Yes, ma'am.
And what option was that?
If you'll go back and read Mr. Preston's contract, there is a clause in there that states that if council votes to not renew his contract, that his contract is not renewed and his contract would expire at the end of the non-renewed term.
And so,
Or something to that effect.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as Defendants Exhibit 1 on page 2 under term. Is that the provision you're talking about, sir?
The last paragraph D, yes, ma'am.
And did Mr. Bright give you all that option or explain that to you?
He never mentioned it.
And did that weigh into how much weight you gave some of his proposals versus the others?
Yes, it did.
Did the fact that you felt he misunderstood the Coward exception, did that weigh into the weight that you gave some of his recommendations versus others?
It did.
And ultimately, did you go through a deliberate decision-making process before you voted on November
I
18th?
most certainly did.
Did you go through a deliberative decision-making process when determining how much you felt the claims that Mr. Preston was asserting and could assert before deciding how much you thought the county should pay Mr. Preston to divorce him?
Okay, I think I've got your question, and I'm gonna try to answer it. If I
Sure.
mixed it up a little bit, we can rehash it.
No problem.
Based on the discussions that we had, it was my belief that it was cheaper to buy out Mr. Preston's contract in the manner in which we did than it was to do nothing and let the events flow as I perceived that they would. It's my opinion then, and it's my opinion now. And that was part of my decision-making process, that what we did that night and what we voted on saved the people of Anderson County in excess of $1 million. However, that has long gone by the wayside. So I hope that's the answer to your question.
Did you at any time when you voted November 18th of 2008 ever conceive that the county would have undertaken the investigation at the cost they did?
I knew, at least I thought I knew, that they would be unhappy. I never dreamed that our elected leaders of Anderson County would be so foolish as to squander away the amount of taxpayer money that they have in pursuit of this.
Are you a Republican?
I ran as a Republican.
Objection. No.
Next question, I'll skip that one. Are you a fiscal conservative?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you believe that what you did on November 18th was being a good fiscal steward of Anderson County's
I
money?
do.
Do you still believe that today?
I do. And I've had citizens relate that belief to me as well.
And with regard to the negotiation that was occurring, do you recall the first demand from Mr. Preston as communicated to you through Mr. Bright?
I'm not sure if it was through Mr. Bright or someone else, but the first number I heard was 1.9, I believe it was,
$1
$1 million.
And you were aware that Mr. Preston had an ongoing lawsuit going on with Ms. Wilson and Mr. Waldrop at that time when the severance also was going on.
I was.
And if you would, if I may approach you on it.
You may.
In Exhibit 1, which is the master agreement. Now, you said you read this a few times. Are you aware that if the severance, is item E on page 4, that contemporaneously with the delivery of all severance pay and entitlements herein set above, the administrator agrees to execute and deliver to the county a release releasing the county of all further claims that the administrator may have against the county. And then that paragraph ends after that. Were you aware of that, sir?
I was.
And are you aware that in the severance agreement, that in exchange for the monies paid to Mr. Preston, that he agreed also to relieve the council members individually of any and all claims that he had against council members individually, including Mr. Waldrop and Ms. Wilson?
I believe that's correct.
Now, did Mr. Preston have any claims against you on November 18th of 2008?
Not that I'm aware of.
He hadn't threatened to sue you for anything, or wasn't suing you for
No.
anything, was he? Was he threatening to sue Mr. McAbee, or was he suing Mr. McAbee for anything?
I don't know, have no knowledge of that.
Did you have any knowledge if he was suing or threatening to sue Mr. Wilson for anything?
No,
Do you have any knowledge if he was suing or threatening to sue Ms. Floyd for anything?
no,
Do you have any knowledge if he had sued or was threatening to sue Mr. Thompson for anything?
no.
Now, you're aware that Mr. McAbee, when there was a fee in lieu voted on for Lincoln Energy and the Lewis Road closure, that Mr. McAbee recused himself from those votes. Do you recall that?
I do.
And I'm going to show you what's marked as Defendants 58. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that process. When Mr. McAbee recused himself during those votes, what did he do?
He made the statement that he had, now this is as best I recall,
Yes, sir.
but he made a statement, something to the effect that he was recusing himself and he had delivered a recusal to the council clerk.
And at that point,
And then he left the room.
okay. Is that the procedure that was operated under during your time on council?
That's what's supposed to happen.
And on November 18th of 2008, despite the fact that Mr. Waldrop and Ms. Wilson would be released by the settlement agreement for their own tort claims, did they file anything with the clerk?
Not to my knowledge.
Did they say that they were going to recuse themselves?
No, they did not.
Did they leave the room or stay in the room?
No, they did not leave the room.
And did they participate in the debate?
Yes, they did.